Ever since a Southern Poverty Law Center designated hate group purchased a church in Murdock, the small town has had a spotlight on it. Let's briefly break down where it all stands. The whites-only organization, the Asatru Folk Assembly, purchased the church last summer. Because the facility is zoned residential, the AFA must apply for a conditional use permit to practice there, and the permit must be renewed yearly. The Murdock City Council will decide on December 9th whether or not to issue the permit. It's important to note that white purity is not a tenet of paganism, heathenry, or Asatru as a whole. It is a tenet of the Asatru Folk Assembly. Compass reached out to the AFA and to the Murdock City Council for this story, but neither responded to an interview request. To unpack the complexities of the history of the white power movement in America, Compass spoke with teacher, historian, and author Dr. Kathleen Belew. Dr. Belew's most recent book, Bring War Home, is a culmination of 10 years of researching the white power movement in America from the Vietnam War to the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. She explains how, as a country, we've never faced America's history of white supremacy, and we've also failed to see white power terrorism as part of a larger movement.
So we usually encounter stories about white power violence through the idea of the lone wolf, quote unquote. In other words, we usually think about the shooting in Pittsburgh as anti-Semitic violence, the shooting in Charleston as anti-Black violence, the shooting in El Paso as anti-Latino violence. And they are all those things, but they're all also white power violence. They were carried out by people who have, in some cases, social ties with each other, people who have ideological framing in common. They use the same slogans, they use the same symbols. So this is not something that is inexplicable and mysterious. This is part of a social movement that is dedicated to this kind of violent activism and has been for decades, if not generations. So one way to think about this is the Oklahoma City bombing, which most people still think of as the work of one or a few bad actors, but actually is the work of a social movement. And it's really notable that we don't understand that event within our broader history. We're talking about the biggest mass casualty event on American soil between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. Most people know about Pearl Harbor and 9/11, but people don't know about Oklahoma City. We don't carry that story with us in the same way. And in large part, that's because this is a social movement that has deliberately tried to evade our understanding. It wants to disappear. And it's used several strategies over the years to try to avoid being described and understood.
Dr. Belew's studies have revealed how white power movements mobilize people to violence by using trends. This reminded me of a documentary from Independent Lens, Feels Good Man. If you stick around to the end of the story, we'll watch the trailer, but briefly, Feels Good Man is about how the white supremacist movement co-opted the Pepe the Frog character. You might be familiar with Pepe the Frog. It was meant to be this goofy little frog, but it turned into a hate symbol used by white supremacists. It's one of the more recent examples of how the white power movement uses trends to spread their messaging. Dr. Belew explained that white power activism is very opportunistic and uses what's cool, like Pepe the Frog memes, to gain popularity.
So that works in two different kinds of ways. One is that it will ride whatever the prevailing tensions are within a community to foment violence. And then the other way that they're opportunistic is by kind of tacking to the prevailing cultural trends. So the time I study in the 1980s, a lot of activists switched to wearing camo fatigues instead of the uniforms that they'd had before. Part of that is because they were interested in like paramilitary tactical readiness, but part of that is just that paramilitary uniforms were cool in the 1980s. Like, not to be trite about it, but you know, that's the same time people are going to paintball courses and reading Soldier of Fortune magazine and watching all those Vietnam War movies. That whole thing was just cool in the 80s. So what these activists are very good at doing is kind of tacking to the prevailing cultural winds so that they can follow the path of least resistance. So in some cases, that means wearing a suit and tie and going on TV and saying, I'm not racist, I'm racialist. In some cases, that means, you know, a tiki torch and a polo shirt. But it just has to do with what's acceptable within a given cultural moment. And they're very, very good at reading those windows of opportunity.
When thinking about the geography of the white power movement, Dr. Belew said that this movement is incredibly diverse in every way but race, tackling what many people call the urban-rural divide.
This is a movement that brought together white power activists of a lot of different ideologies, people across a lot of different class backgrounds, educational backgrounds. It's in every region of the country, and it unified people across urban, suburban, and rural spaces. Now, there are profound cultural differences between those spaces within this activism, just as there are big differences between city and rural area in other ways. So the notable one in the time of my study is that in the rural areas, the activists tended to be more socially conservative. So we're talking about faith-based white power communities with very gender normative practices, whereas in the cities, you were more likely to find things like skinhead activism. Skinheads in the early 90s would be, into, like, women would wear heavy makeup and go topless. They would be into alcohol and drugs and serious music scenes. That wasn't the case for people in the rural areas most of the time. But all of these activists saw themselves as under attack and perceived a state of emergency so intense that they talked about this. They said, we have to figure out how to accept all of these people into our movement, because if we don't, the whole race will be annihilated, and that'll be it.
Thinking about this from a solutions-based perspective, Dr. Belew said that because this is a phenomenon that requires ignorance and inattention across multiple levels, there are also multiple levels of response that can have a big impact. One is providing resources for teachers and parents. Another is grassroots organization. Murdock resident Victoria Guillemard co-founded the local organization Murdock Area Alliance Against Hate.
So when I first learned about the Asatru Folk Assembly moving into Murdock, I felt really powerless. Like, I didn't know what to do. I spent probably a good 48 hours glued to my laptop, Googling, researching, trying to find out as much information as possible. And I wanted to have friends and family members have a space where they could go with their questions and where we could form a group that was education-based and focused on not just what was happening at that very instant, but also the future of Murdock if a hate group was going to move in.
Guillemard said that she's gotten a lot of support and information from Heathens Against Hate, an organization that promotes inclusive heathenry.
The way that the AFA has been described to me by other heathens is that they are an off-branch, like very small and very extremist version of the Asatru belief system, that many other churches, including other Asatru religions, have denounced them, and that as a whole, heathenism is not inherently racist. When you look at the Asatru Folk Assembly, they've clearly been labeled dangerous by other heathens, enough so that there's even a declaration called the Declaration 127 that was signed by other heathen and Asatru congregations denouncing them because of their dangerous belief systems.
In an email, Ethan Stark from Heathens Against Hate explained that Declaration 127 is named after the 127th stanza from a manuscript that heathenry relies on for virtues and ethics. The full declaration is under revision to address overall racism found in heathenry beyond the scope of the AFA, but it was initially drafted for individuals and organizations to formally and officially denounce and disassociate with the AFA. Over the past number of months, Stark has been offering similar information to other residents of Murdock.
He even has been hosting Zoom calls where people in Murdock can log in and listen to him talk about the difference between the Asatru Folk Assembly and other Asatru Nordic religions.
Welcome, everyone, one and all, to Heathens Against Hate, our Murdock, Minnesota Q&A and open hall.
He gave him a space to go to learn about where you can safely practice a Nordic religion without having it be a white supremacist belief system.
You know, when they're saying that they're good neighbors, you're going into Murdock that is 90+% Caucasian, and when you're saying good neighbors, there's that subtlety of we're good neighbors to particular people. And so I don't believe this good neighbor shtick. It's something that many other exclusionary groups have pretended to be.
Guillemard is a second-year law student, and while she couldn't make a statement on the current situation or on conditional use permits as a whole, she did break down the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act.
RLIPA, that is the governing law on this matter. And I will say this, it's tragic that a hate organization is able to manipulate and control a situation knowing that they are preying on the vulnerability of an indigent community, specifically Murdock as a municipality. Murdock is very underfunded, does not have resources, and they know that litigation is the number one fear that is holding back the city council on voting based on their beliefs. And that is strictly a legal standpoint. I feel it in my heart that city council members would not be granting a conditional use permit if they did not have fear of litigation in their hearts.
Now, as promised, the Feels Good Man trailer.
I've just always been into drawing. It takes tons of time to come up with a character. And then eventually it was Pepe. It's a happy little frog. We like drinking and hanging out. It became Boys Club.
It's one of the funniest comics of the last 10 years.
Feels good, man.
That was the frame that started it all.
PP is the best.
Pepe became a meme. I didn't even know what a meme was.
There were all these boys trying to own each other on the message boards.
In drops Pepe, right for the taking. He had gone dark.
The white supremacist movement has taken over Pepe the Frog.